The ways that people in different cultures communicate with each other varies a lot from culture to culture. Specifically, people speak very directly and say exactly what they mean. Cultures, people speak indirectly and kind of circumlocute their way of what they want to say. Now, this is a phenomenon that you're familiar with on some level because you've all experienced circumstances in which differences in communication style become evident. For instance, in my family of origin, in the Becker household where I grew up, we speak very plainly and very directly. So, for instance, after a nice meal at a restaurant, someone reaches for the check and says, "I'll get it this time." What we take that to mean is, "I'll get it this time." And the response to an offer like that is, "Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you." You might say, "Are you sure?" And or you might just let me get the tip, but you'd never press it any further than that. But in Emily's family of origin, the words "I'll get it this time" don't mean "I'll get it this time." What they mean is, "I challenge you to a duel. I'm willing to pay the bill, and I expect you to offer as well. And for the next 3 minutes, we're going to square off about this." Well, when Emily and I got married, I was unfamiliar with this ritual. And when I was told about the ritual, I didn't really have any interest in participating in it. So I didn't. I always just cut the Gordian knot and made a short game of it. I offered to pay. If the offer was accepted, I paid. If the offer was rejected, I admitted defeat, thanked my challenger, and let him pay. The end. Because words have meaning, and I value plain speech, direct speech. And though it took 10 years or so, Tom and Eric eventually accepted my rules of engagement on this plane. And once we were all on the same page, there was never any misunderstanding. But there could have been. And that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. The potential for misunderstanding when there's a cultural difference in the way words are used or in the way that communication occurs. Now, in the case of this difference between me and my in-laws, there wasn't that much of a cultural divide to overcome. Both Tom and Eric are advocates of free speech and plain speech, direct communication in general. And in this one area of cultural nicety, it was just kind of a hiccup, a slight difference in manners, which I think was probably a vestige of a latent regional difference, a family heritage difference, or a slight class difference in our families, which I'm aware of because Tom's adoptive family, his mother in particular, it seems to me, had a very clear sense of cultural and societal manners that was a level above or a level removed from anything that I had in my family background. But those kinds of cultural differences are quite small and inconsequential compared to the cultural divide between Eastern societies and Western societies when it comes to direct speech and indirect speech. Because in Western societies, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Netherlands, people tend to speak very directly, saying exactly what they mean. But in Eastern societies, such as Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, people tend to speak much more indirectly, speaking in euphemisms, figures of speech, idioms, and sometimes just even flat out saying the opposite of what they actually mean. Cultures where direct speech is used are often referred to as low context cultures. Cultures where people speak more indirectly are often referred to as high context cultures. Quoting from a paper by R.S. Zaharna, the difference between high and low context cultures depends on how much meaning is found in the context versus the code. Low context cultures, such as the American culture, tend to place more meaning in the language code and very little meaning in the context. For this reason, communication tends to be specific, explicit, and analytical. In high context cultures, meaning is embedded more in the context rather than in the code. Thus, the listener must understand certain contextual cues in order to grasp the full meaning of the message. People raised in high context systems expect more from others than do the participants in low context systems. When talking about something that they have on their mind, a high context individual will expect the people that he's talking to know what's bothering him. So he doesn't have to say it. He doesn't have to be specific. The result is that he will talk and around the point, in effect, putting all the pieces in place except for the crucial one. In other words, in high context exchanges, much of the burden of meaning appears to fall on the listener. In low context cultures, the burden of meaning appears to fall on the speaker to actually and thoroughly convey the meaning in her spoken or written language. And author Sarah Lanier said in an interview, the way that people speak in Arab culture, for instance, on the other hand, is much more indirect. It's all about friendliness and politeness. If offered a cup of coffee, I say, no, thank you. The host offers it again, and I decline again with something like, no, don't bother yourself. He might offer a third time, and I'd reply, no, really, I don't want any coffee, believe me. And then my host serves the coffee, and I drink it. When asked, but what if you really don't want coffee? Lanier explained that such a conversation would take several minutes and would involve many words of praise and gratitude and respect and polite but false promises of future coffees together. And the reason why this is important for us to understand is because everything in the Bible happens against the backdrop of a high context culture in which indirect speech is used as much or more than direct speech is used. And understanding this is vitally important to properly understanding certain Bible passages. And I think it's vitally important to properly understanding what's taking place before the Sanhedrin when the apostles are on trial before the high court. Because if you read Acts 5 as a Westerner, you'll miss an underlying thread in that text that I think sheds light on what Gamaliel says to his fellow elders on the high council. Now, there are lots of examples of high context communication in the Bible. Lots of examples of people speaking in veiled language. We see it in the words of Cain, in the conversations between Abraham and Pharaoh and Abraham and Abimelech, when Abraham told these men that Sarah was his sister. In conversations between Jacob and Esau, when Jacob is wresting Esau's birthright from him. In the conversations between Jacob and Laban, when Laban is trying to justify switching Leah for Rachel. And in conversation with Joseph and his brothers, when his brothers came to Egypt in search of grain. But one of the most instructive examples is in Genesis 23, when Sarah died and Abraham purchased the field at Machpelah to use as his family cemetery. Genesis 23, 1 through 20. Sarah lived 127 years. Then she died at Hebron, Canaan. And Abraham stopped and mourned and wept over her. Then Abraham stood up, and for the sake of his dearly departed, went out to address the local council, known as the sons of Het, the people of the land, and as the sons of the people, saying, "Here I am, a visitor in a foreign land with no place to bury my wife. Will you sell me a plot of land so that I may bury my dead in a private plot?" The sons of Het replied, "As God is our witness, the Prince of Elohim is standing right before us. You may have the finest burial plot in the country. There's not a man among us who would ever try to stop you from burying your dead wherever you wish." Abraham rose up, then bowed to the ground before the people of the land, the sons of Het, and spoke to them, saying, "Since this is your feeling in the matter, that I'm entitled to bury my dead in a private plot, be so kind as to ask Ephron, the son of Zohar, to sell me the cave of Machpelah down at the end of this field. I will, of course, pay the full price for it, whatever is publicly agreed upon, and it will become a permanent cemetery for my family." Ephron the Hittite had a seat on the sons of Het, and he answered Abraham in a loud voice, so that all the members of the council and everyone in the vicinity of the city gates could hear him. "Let it go on record with the sons of my people. I will give you the land and the cave at no charge. Go and bury your dead." Abraham once again bowed before the people of the land and answered Ephron in front of the council, saying, "Let the record reflect that I will accept the land only if you accept payment from me, the full market price." Ephron answered Abraham, "Well, sir, the property is worth 400 silver shekels, but what is that between you and me? Now please go, bury your dead." Abraham agreed, and this constituted a sale. Abraham counted out 400 silver shekels to Ephron, just as they'd agreed in the hearing before the sons of Het. This was the full market price for such a property. The property deed that Abraham received from Ephron reads as follows: "Let all men know by these presents that the property which is owned by Ephron the Hittite, which is known as Ephron's field, shall now be the property of Abraham the Hebrew. That the above-named property shall be designated as the particular field located at Machpelah, across from Mamre. This is the extent of the above-named property, that the extent of the above-named property shall be defined as the natural boundary of the field in every direction to its fullest length and breadth in every direction. That the full scope of the above-named property shall include the field, the cave in the field, and all the trees on the field. That the sale of the above-named property has been certified as a legal sale and was agreed upon by both parties in the full hearing and by all the public citizens passing by the city gates." After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave of the field of Machpelah, across from Mamre, Canaan. This is how Abraham acquired the field and the cave from the sons of Het. This is the same property which became his family burial plot. Now, clearly, Abraham doesn't care for the sons of Het. He doesn't like them, and he doesn't trust them. But he never says so, not directly. Now, he's capable of more direct language. For instance, he's much more direct with Lot when he wants to be. I mean, Lot is family. Abraham doesn't like him, and he doesn't trust him. So in Genesis 13, he took the top of a high mountain and said, "Pick your parcel. You go right, I'll go left. You go left, I'll go right. Don't go away mad, just go away." But here in Genesis 23, he uses much more subtle language. He clearly wants nothing to do with the sons of Het. Like I say, he doesn't like them and he doesn't trust them. That's made clear by the explicit detail that he uses in the bill of sale and the property description. And he doesn't want to give them the slightest edge. He wants no favors from them. He wants to make sure that they can make no claims of any kind against him. He will not accept the land as a gift. He wants to pay for it and pay the full market price for it, and he does. Indeed, according to biblical scholars who've studied the economics of the ancient Near East, Abraham paid many times the fair market value for the 400 shekels was half a king's ransom. But willing to pay it because he wants there to be no question at all. As he said much more plainly to the king of Sodom when he offered money to Abraham after the War of the Nine Kings in Genesis 14, But Abram replied to the king of Sodom, I raise my hand in the presence of Yahweh El Elyon, the creator of heaven and earth. I will not accept one thread from you, not one sandal strap. You will never be given the opportunity to say, I made Abram rich. No, nothing for me. I agree to keep only what my men have already eaten. However, you are free to give a share to my allies, Anir, Eshcol, and Mamre. Here, his language is much more veiled, much more indirect, much more guarded. And what about the sale itself? I mean, there's nothing in this transcript of this conversation between Abram and Ephraim that would hold up in a Western court of law as being a verbal agreement. But as obtuse as the words are to us in 21st century America, when Ephraim said, the property is worth 400 silver shekels, but what's that between you and me? To their Eastern ears, that constituted a sale. And that makes Genesis 23 a kind of quintessential example of the kind of language I'm talking about. High context, indirect speech, the clarity of which depends not on the explicit words of the speaker, on the implicit intuition of the listener. But before we move on and examine Acts 5, looking for this kind of language, I want to give you one more example from the Old Testament, a darker, more sinister example, which is found in Genesis 4. Now, this may seem like an obscure reference if you haven't read the book of Genesis in a while. But you may recall that Cain's fifth generation grandson was a man named Lamech. And that though Lamech's sons were highly accomplished, Jabal being the forefather of all shepherds, Jubal being the forefather of all musicians, and Tubal-Cain being the forefather of all blacksmiths, Lamech himself was an outlaw. Now, I didn't catch on to that fact until 1994. That was the year that I did my first work as a Bible translator, and I translated the book of Genesis. And when I came to Genesis 4, 23 through 24, I stopped and looked at that text for quite a long time. Because there we have this saying of Lamech's. And when I studied this passage, my first thought was, why is this here? Because what Lamech says in this passage seems pretty unremarkable, not all that memorable or important. So why is it remembered? Why is it being repeated? Unless it was something that Lamech was kind of famous for saying over and over. And then it hit me, yeah, that must be it. This wasn't something that Lamech said once. This was something that he said all the time, over and over. And I looked it up, and sure enough, the grammar here couldn't be more clear in the Hebrew. This is an imperfect verb describing an ongoing action. Literally, he is saying, or he always said. This is something that Lamech was known for saying all the time. Only he didn't say it to everyone. He said it to his wives, plural. And this is significant because the Lamech in Genesis 4 isn't the same as the Lamech in Genesis 5. Lamech in Genesis 5 is a descendant of Seth and the father of Noah. Lamech in Genesis 4 is a descendant of Cain, and he's the first polygamist in the Bible. He had two wives, Adah and Zillah, and he had a particular way of keeping those two wives in check. He threatened them with violence. And he did so constantly, telling them, I killed a man for no reason. I even killed a little kid, pretty much for nothing. But that's not all. You remember Cain, how he killed Abel, and how God put a mark on Cain to protect him, saying that anyone who did him harm would be punished 7 times as severely as he. Well, I'm 10 times worse than Cain. I've murdered so many people that God had to make the punishment for harming me 70-fold. Lamech wrote the primer on domestic violence by constantly intimidating his wives. Only he did it subtly, in veiled language. Genesis 4, 23 through 24, Lamech used to say to his wives, "Let the ears of Adah and Zillah revive, and listen to Lamech, for you are his wives. I took a man's life for causing me harm. I killed a small boy for striking my arm. If Cain is protected by sevenfold payment, then 70-fold is required for Lamech." Now, if you don't think that that's menacing language, you've never been privy to a serious domestic abuse situation. This isn't a confession. He isn't testifying against himself. For all we know, he isn't even telling the truth. I mean, he doesn't name his victims. He doesn't allocute to a crime in a way that would satisfy a judge. His language is just direct enough and just enough to give uncertainty a foothold, to create doubt and fear, and to let the imagination run wild. This is classic intimidation 101. And if you don't believe me, just turn on the Lifetime Network and watch some of those spouse abuser movies. They're all spouse abuser movies, so you can turn it on anytime. And that's what you'll see. I guarantee that if the script is any good, this is exactly the way that those wife beaters talk to their wives. Like gangsters. Like members of the Cosa Nostra. Make him an offer he can't refuse. Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes. Or like Walter White, I'm not the danger. I'm not in danger. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No, I am the one who knocks. Maximum obfuscation, resulting in maximum intimidation. Because though there's nothing indictable in his exact words, you pretty much know what he means. And how do you know? By the context. This is high context communication. Now, for comparison, let's turn to Acts 5, where the apostles are under arrest and on trial before the Sanhedrin. And let's watch our main players in action, beginning with our old friend Caiaphas. Acts 5, 27 through 28. And when they had brought them in, they set them before the council. And the high priest questioned them, saying, "We strictly charged you not to teach in this name. Yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, the intention of bringing this man's blood upon us." Now, this isn't a very long speech, but it's enough for our study today. First, Caiaphas starts off by making a half-true claim, saying, "We strictly charged you not to do this," when he knows full good and well that the apostles weren't listening to him when he made that charge, and they had made it perfectly clear at the time that they had no intention of obeying him or doing as he had said. Acts 4, 19 through 20. But Peter and John replied, "Which is right in the eyes of God, to listen to you or to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen." And yet, Caiaphas has the gall to act surprised and insulted now, when the apostles did exactly what they promised they would do by keeping on proclaiming the name of Jesus. Second, take notice that when Caiaphas makes this accusation here, he cannot bring himself to even say the name of Jesus. In the Harry Potter series, there's a character who's referred to as he who must not be named. And the reason for that is because everyone despises and fears Voldemort, whose name in French means flight of death. But Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And Caiaphas despises and fears him so much, his name. And third, Caiaphas' weak preemptive case of defense for himself before the council. Just like Lamech, Caiaphas won't actually name his victim or his crime. All he can muster is a non-denial denial, which he words as an accusation. You have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, with the intention of bringing this man's blood upon us. He's a complete and utter coward, and his spinelessness is revealed in his high context language, his indirect and dishonest speech, which only by careful analysis reveals the truth. Now contrast that with Peter's to Caiaphas. Because Jesus taught his disciples to let their yes mean yes, and their no mean no. One of the most remarkable things about the New Testament is the fact that the apostles defy their culture with their speech. The apostles speak in a very strange way for the Middle East. It makes sense to us, but this was very strange for their time and for their culture, to speak directly the way that they speak and to mean exactly what they say. They don't speak in indirect half-truths. When Jesus spoke, people listened because he spoke the truth. He spoke with conviction, and he spoke with authority. And he spoke with authority not just because he's the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, but because he's true, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And there's no fear in that. And he taught his disciples to do the same. He taught his disciples to speak like Horton. I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. And elephant's faithful 100%. Now, last week I asked the question, why does Peter speak so directly? Why is he so confrontational? Is it really necessary for him to always speak truth to power? Do all the things he says really need to be said? Well, think how you feel right now after hearing all the doublespeak that all the people in this culture tend to use. I mean, doesn't it make you just feel yucky? The more you listen to people speak in half-truths, can't you just feel the darkness closing in on you? Well, compare that to the way it makes you feel when Peter speaks. Acts 5:29 and following. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised Jesus up, whom you killed, by hanging him on a tree. Boy, there's nothing subtle about that. God exalted him at his right hand as firstborn and savior to bring repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sin. And we are witnesses to these things. It's the Holy Spirit, whom God has given to those who obey him. Beloved, there's no equivocation here, no half-truths, no obfuscation, no indirect language. This speech is as low context can be. You don't even have to know the backstory to know that Peter's telling the truth and that he's doing it without flinching. Now consider the words of Gamaliel. Acts 5:33-39. When they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. But a Pharisee in the council named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in honor by all the people, stood up and gave orders to put the men outside and he said to them, men of Israel, take care what you are about to do with these men. For some time ago, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even find yourself at odds with God. Now, as one who live in a direct language culture and who engage habitually in low context speech, we make certain assumptions about Gamaliel and about the things that he says. We look at this and we give Gamaliel every benefit of the doubt. We perceive him as a good guy with good intentions. Gamaliel comes highly recommended, so we tend to take what he says at face value. What he says looks like godly advice of sorts on the surface, but just put your fingernail under his words and pull back a couple of layers of misdirection, and it looks a little different. At least it does to me. And I'm not wearing my tinfoil hat. See, there's a good psychological rule of thumb that I learned many years ago that has helped me to separate truth from falsehood in lots of situations. And the rule is this: if someone says something and you're not sure about their motive, look at the outcome of their words, and then infer the motive by examining the results. Remember how about a year ago in lesson number 226 of this series, Act Your Age, I told you about the rabbi system in first century Jerusalem, first century Judaism, and how it was that Jesus was a rabbi who, in keeping with his tradition, started teaching when he turned 30, and that the apostles, most of whom were teenagers, except for Peter, who was in his 20s, were his students. And they followed him like a sensei, living with him full time, and they hung on his every word. Well, Gamaliel was also a rabbi. Now, he was much older than Jesus, and he had graduated several classes of young students. But make no mistake about it, his students were also teenage boys when they were his students, and they followed him just as closely as the 12 followed Jesus. And the students of Gamaliel hung on his every word. Only Gamaliel wasn't the way, the truth, and the life. And he wasn't an advocate of direct speech. He was an Eastern in an Eastern culture, and he was a scholar and master rhetorician. And he had the art of speaking in indirect language down to a science. And in his speech to the Sanhedrin, he says something that, to me, raises questions. And he doesn't want the apostles to hear it. So he puts them out of the room when he says it. Now, I don't want to make light of this matter, but just for the sake of cultural clarity, just for cultural context, I want you to imagine the following words coming from the mouth of a studied, practical, and artful double speaker. So don't imagine this being said in the voice of Stewart or Henry Fonda or Tom Hanks. Rather, imagine these words coming out of the mouth of Joe Pesci or Robert De Niro or James Gandolfini. Because what Gamaliel says to the high council is, remember that guy, Judas? He started talking a big game. He wound up dead. And the Sanhedrin didn't have to lift a finger. Some people in a lynch mob took care of it. And remember that other guy, Judas the Galilean? He started making some noise. He wound up dead. And no one here ever had to say a word, lift a finger. Somebody else took care of it. What about these guys? Don't sweat it. If they keep talking smack, something will happen to them. Forget about it. God will take care of it. Now, does that sound over the top sinister? Is that ridiculous? Is that cartoonish? Do I sound crazy? Does it seem conspiratorial and paranoid? Am I wrong to ascribe that kind of motive to Gamaliel? Well, if someone says something and you're unsure of their motive, look at the outcome of their words and then infer the motive by examining the results. Gamaliel told the Sanhedrin, hey guys, hands off. Don't worry about these guys. They get out of hand, something will happen to it. They'll be taken care of. And that satisfied the members of the high council, who just 5 minutes earlier wanted to kill the apostles. Now they're content to leave the fate of the apostles up to the tendency of troublemakers to wind up dead. But that isn't all that happened. Because you turn the page, and in chapter 6 of the book of Acts, we find Stephen, a man full of grace, a faithful Christian, a teacher of the word, and a deacon of the church, being seized by a mob of politically connected militia types. And then you turn to chapter 7, and within an hour of turning to that page, this mob had stoned to death. And at the end of chapter 7, who do we find standing in the midst of that mob, holding their coats? Holding the coats of the men who stoned Stephen, but keeping his own hands clean. Who's doing that but Gamaliel's star pupil? His brightest and his best protege. None other than Saul of Tarsus. A man who confesses in his own words in Acts 22:3 that he studied at the feet of Gamaliel, and who in Acts 9 is described by Luke as breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. Intrigued? Do I have your attention? And do you want the rest of the story? Come back next week, and I'll give it to you. That's my lesson for today.